welcoming remarks from myself. And I'll start by saying good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this webinar organized by CC, Center for the Study of the Economies of Africa, a think tank that conducts evidence-based research on economic and development issues in Africa, and ID Insight, an advisory, data analytics, and research organization that generates and uses evidence to make effective decisions. Today's webinar is focused on a relevant and topical issue, the reopening of schools in Nigeria. The closure of schools in Nigeria for over 6 months was in line with the global public health safety procedures. But this closure has really resulted in significant learning losses that will be challenging to recover. CC and ID Insights have examined this issue of reopening schools in Nigeria and have provided guidelines for reopening school safety and recommendations for the reopening of schools to recover learning losses. So this webinar is essentially a platform to bring together stakeholders from the government, school owners, and the research community to discuss the approaches, the guidelines, and the support needed to effectively reopen schools and recover the losses in learning. I therefore welcome you all to this webinar, and I look forward to fruitful discussions. Thank you very much. Over to you, Tana.
My thing was muted. Thank you very much, Chuka. Erica, do you want to introduce ID Insight quickly?
Yes, thank you, Thelma. So a super quick introduction to ID Insight and the work we do. So at ID Insight, we use data and evidence to help development leaders maximize their social impact across the globe. We have a broad range of analytical tools to help our counterparts design better policies, test them rigorously, and then use this evidence to implement them effectively at scale. In the work that we do, we try to place a special emphasis on tailoring our rigorous methods to fit the real world constraints that the decision makers who we work normally face. So thank you, Thelma. And thanks everyone for joining today.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you. Just a quick note. So Chuka is the director at CC and Erica is a manager at ID Insight. I'll just give a quick brief on this webinar, a quick note before I hand over to our panelists to start the conversation. Essentially, CC and ID Insight had issued a policy brief recently titled Reopening Schools for Learning. I've included a link to the policy brief in the chat section. So if anyone who hasn't had access to it or read it, feel free to open it, read it, share your thoughts with us. This webinar on learning is essentially part of the effort to support the Nigerian government as they implement the reopening of schools. Essentially, we aim to share experiences and lessons, expertise, and strategies to ensure learning and teaching can continue, together with any pedagogical approaches when transitioning from school closure to school reopening. So this can include things like monitoring learning gaps and providing appropriate remedial action, paying particular attention to preventing exacerbation of learning inequalities. On the panel today, we have 3 wonderful people. We have Obi Obiwulu, who is a communications consultant at CC. Obi has been working extensively on the field since the beginning of the pandemic. I mean, after the lockdowns, documenting the effects of the pandemic on everyday people. And he's going to share a bit of a video with us and his thoughts on some of the things that he's experienced on the field. We also have Dr. Folake Olatunji David, who is the director or a director at the Federal Ministry of Education. And we have Mrs. Olushola Bankole, who is the chairperson of the National Association of Proprietors of Private Schools. Before we go to the panelists, however, we're going to give both ID Insights and CC a chance to present the policy brief. And on the ID Insight team, we have Erica Caballero, who will start. So Erica gave a little introduction at the beginning. And Dr. Adedeji Adeniran, who is the Director of Education and Governance Research at CC, will also assist her. Okay, Erica, do you want to start?
Yes, definitely. Let me share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see it?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Yes, so thanks again, everyone. Over the past 8 months, the COVID-19 induced school closures have limited the access to learning to close to 1.5 billion students worldwide. During this presentation, we will discuss some of the implications of these closures and provide a set of recommendations to create a safe learning environment and to address the learning losses. So with the gradual decline in the incidence of COVID-19, governments, including Nigeria, have started to think about school reopening. When deciding on the best approach, governments face a trade-off. On one hand, they face pressures to return to school, and on the other one, they face risks. On the pressure side, school reopening is expected to halt the disruptions on student learning. It should also allow more families to return to work, and it should have a positive impact on students relying on schools for meals, health services, and other social protection benefits. On the risk side, however, a return to school will carry a public health risk, which is the reason why schools closed in the first place. In line with our recommendations, governments have started implementing a phased reopening of schools following different strategies. One example is countries such as Nigeria, Ghana, Liberia, or Sierra Leone, where governments have decided that the initial reopening phases will target transitional grades, where older students may be more prone to comply with social distancing measures and will also be able to present transitional exams. Moving forward, we expect that the decisions about school reopening will follow an iterative process. As local circumstances change and as our own understanding of COVID-19 evolves, authorities and schools will likely need a data-driven approach to assess and reassess the situation to decide not only whether to fully reopen schools or not, but also to decide a set of criteria for when and if schools should shut down again. In the following slides, we will be sharing some of the recommendations that we have included in the policy brief. So let's get started with the guidance that we have ambitioned for schools. And this one falls into three main pillars. The first one is infrastructure, second one, health and sanitation, and finally, school scheduling. Zooming into infrastructure, we recommend adapting common spaces to maintain social distance, adapting hand washing stations at common areas to promote regular hygiene, and engage school administrators to procure and distribute critical hygiene items and basic PPE. In order to comply with these recommendations, local authorities should assess school wash infrastructure readiness, and they should also look into the availability of hygienic resources. Moving on to health and sanitation, we suggest delivering training to students, teachers, and staff, including cleaning staff, and how to comply with IPC measures. It's also very important to think about the dissemination of these measures using age and language appropriate messages. Second, we suggest to reestablish regular and safe delivery of essential services, such as school feeding programs and vaccinations campaigns following strict hygienic protocols. In terms of preventive measures, schools can establish mandatory temperature checks, and also they can promote the regular and appropriate use of face masks. And finally, Schools should encourage and mandate sick students and staff to remain at home. They should also procure space to quarantine symptomatic students in case that they end up reaching school facilities. Moving on the last point, which is school scheduling. We are suggesting to stagger school openings and class schedule to reduce the overall concentration of students and also limiting the interaction between teachers and students. We have seen schools in some countries such as Denmark and Norway using a pod system where learners only interact with other students and teachers within their own group. As authorities prepare to reopen schools, apart from engaging with schools, they should coordinate with a broader group of stakeholders, which includes teachers, parents, and the overall community. First, I want to highlight two overarching strategies resulting from the interactions between these stakeholders. First, it is very important to facilitate the engagement between parents and teachers to define their roles and responsibilities very clearly. And the second one is to establish linkages between public health authorities and schools in order to deploy public health messages and also to monitor the community spread. Now let's zoom into our recommendations for teachers. So we suggest developing pedagogical processes to assess learning losses, the learning losses that happen during school closures. We will provide a little bit more of detail into the second part of this presentation. Second, we suggest providing technical professional development options to teachers so they can explore curriculum adaptation. These can be, for example, through peer learning groups. And everyone is expecting that the pandemic will increase the number of students who have experienced traumatic events. And as a result, we suggest that teachers should be trained to offer not only academic, but also psychosocial support. Moving on to parents, we are recommending the use of multiple channels of communication to train them on COVID-19 and encourage them to share this information with their children. A central piece of our thinking around parent engagement is empowerment. So empowerment to encourage them to self-report if their children have either presented symptoms, tested positive, or been exposed to the virus, and also empowerment to keep children at home if they are considered as clinically vulnerable. Finally, we encourage parents to become role models and reinforce the good hygiene practices at home. The final two recommendations that we make on community engagement is to set up effective communication and coordination mechanisms in order to build consensus between stakeholders. And this will allow the government to inform about the reopening mechanisms and also to address any misinformations that might be out there. Overall, planning for safe school reopening is and will be a complex decision where the specifics should be defined in consultation with relevant stakeholders, which, as we have mentioned, should include education leaders, departments of public health, school administrators, teacher associations, and the overall community. Thank you, and over to you, Dr. Lady.
Okay. Is it my turn?
Yes, David, over to you.
Oh, sorry. Oh, thanks everyone. And so by the way of introduction, I'm Adedeji Adeniro. I work for Center for Study of Economics of Africa, and we're happy to partner ID Insight on this. So just to jump on the conversation, the rich conversation Erica started, he has mentioned and discussed vigorously the issue around reopening schools. But our idea is that side by side, reopening schools should go with reopening learning. And what do we mean by reopening learning? Reopening learning means that we need to ensure that we don't just get kids to school. We need to ensure that quality education takes place when they get to school. And this is a major problem because, I mean, when you look at the past and you revisit Nigerian education system, pre-pandemic, you find that we have a lot of problems in both quantity and quality. So when you look at access to education, Nigeria still has the highest out-of-school children in the world, which is a major problem government is trying to address. But we also have equity concerns in terms of, along various dimensions, gender, location, regions, and school type, and the rest. But the major issue that led to the creation of SDG, especially SDG 4, which has the goal of ensuring quality and equitable education for all, is around the problem of there's a lot of kids going to school, but learning is not taking place in most schools. And if you look at Nigeria experience, let me quickly show this. So this is data set from collected by National Population Commission. It's called Nigeria Education Data Survey. And if you look at percentage of pupils in schools with literacy competencies, and what we mean by this is your ability to say simple things about things of everyday life. For instance, this is a cat, those kind of things, so ability to read a simple sentence. And when you look at performance, you look at, for people that have not been to school, out of school children, they are 2%. But when you look at, and you situate this within the curriculum or Nigerian education system, you expected that at least most of the kids should have actually learned these around primary 2 or primary 1. But when you look primary 1, only 10%, primary 2, only 17%. Even when we get to the end of primary school, still about 44% of the kids cannot still read this thing. And when you even go to secondary education, you find out that even though the result improved, we still have a pocket of kids out there that are not are still doing well, even in primary 1, primary 2 kind of assessment. So this is the crisis that we faced before the COVID-19. And the question for policy making and for all of us is, do we have enough strength, or are we planning enough to ensure that we tackle this in such that we do not amplify crisis that we already have in our hand? And when you look at what has happened over the last 3 months, so this is the data collected by MBS in April, May, and June. And it tried to track how much learning is taking place during COVID-19. And if you can see, if you look at the last line, it talks about the engagement in education activities by students. You find out that at the maximum, and less than only about 68% were involved in any form of education activities in April. By the time you go to June, that has reduced to 56%. And if you look at the dissect the result and see what are the kind of modalities where we are using to bridge learning, you find that the majority of the activities is about being taught by parents or self-learning by kids themselves. You find that the go-to kind of alternative to physical interaction, such as online, are not actually quite taken up by a lot of schools or parents or students. You see that online learning has less than 1%. So it shows that over the last 6 or 7 months that we experienced school closure, learning were not taking place in many instances. I mean, the traditional, the typical kind of learning interaction you expect in school are not taking place. And if you already have crisis of learning, you can imagine that that lost kind of time might have amplified learning loss. So in the next set of slides, I want to quickly talk about how do we ensure we recover these learning loss. And number one on the items is for schools, we are recommending that schools should focus more on foundational learning. What we mean by this is kind of the gateway into learning, the mathematics, the English or languages, as it may be. That if we focus on these, so there are many school subjects that kids can be taught. But in order to ensure that we quickly recover from effect of COVID-19, we might need to focus on this foundational learning more. It might mean allocating more time to it, or we ensure that we find a way of supplementing these kids to ensure that they learn a lot on this foundational skills. If we are able to teach them to learn, so a kid that can read can be able to read other subject area rather than being shut out of learning completely. The other thing we are recommending is ensuring frequent decision relevant learning assessment. And what we mean by this is schools need to, immediately kids enter into school, we need to test them to know what has been lost. After learning what has been lost, we need to also move to be learned. After we start the remedial training or supplement training, we need to actually then begin to implement, do this assessment either on weekly basis, bi-weekly or monthly basis, such that we know what has been the recovery process in order to ensure that we recover the learning loss. The third point, which we are emphasizing, is we might need to introduce some form of teaching at the right level. And the simple teaching at the right level simply means that ensuring that we restructure our school system such that we are not just dividing classes by grade, but we are dividing it by skill level. So for instance, someone can be age 8 and expectedly at the age of, when you're 8 years old, you should be in either primary 3 or primary 4. But if your skill level is still primary 1, that means you might need to actually be provided some supplemental teaching to ensure that you cope with what is going on, what you are lacking. And that's actually the whole idea about teaching at the right level, trying to ensure that we divide or structure school by skill level. And this is very important because it's different. So some kids that want to do trading, they might not have lost much, but some will be so much that we need to around their skill level. The blended learning. COVID-19 has allowed us to experiment with a lot of alternatives to face-to-face interaction. All these distant learning tools were brought into play during this conversation. So I think we need to actually not forgo this going forward. We need to amplify this and ensure that we use it as part of the learning such that we can recover learning. And the last one is giving priority to vulnerable students, people that are unable to learn so much during the lockdown and they were unable to have access to this alternative learning modality. We need to prioritize them in terms of our recovery efforts. In terms of, most of these issues we discuss are quite germane because we understand that at primary and secondary level, state government and private school owners play more roles. So those kind of, the set of advice might be much more aligned with them. But in terms of federal government also could play a number of roles. One of the roles in terms of augmenting state and private sector resources. COVID-19 has been also a financial pandemic. And in this stance, we believe government can support state government, private school owners that have been badly affected by this pandemic in order to ensure that we respond to this. And if there is any private school owner on this call, I want to just suggest that a lot of strategy that government has put in place to support small-scale businesses is also available for us. We need to exploit this funding mechanism in order to support school system. we also need, I mean, it's also federal government that sets standard according to the Constitution and according to the National Policy on Education. In setting this, I mean, we might need to be flexible around what the curriculum. At this period, we might need to be more flexible about the, our assessment. How do we do this assessment such that we are not leaving kids behind? Because, I mean, they've lost a lot of learning time. And if we just use this assessment in order to evaluate them, maybe for promotion or scholarship and all those things, that might actually not be reflective of their knowledge. So those kind of flexibility needs to come into play. And also, I mean, federal government can coordinate sharing of knowledge and learning across state. Also, as we can learn from government, we can also learn from private sector. So, I mean, it's a conversation among everyone that we need to actually just find a space to scale it up and ensure that we enrich the conversation. And lastly, we need to set in motion key direction for long-term restructuring of Nigerian education system. I mean, the point here is we have a system that is already under crisis. We need to do more. So thanks for the time.
Thank you very much, Deji, and thank you very much, Erica. Those were both very great presentations. Before I give the floor over to our panelists, I just wanted to, a quick housekeeping note. We will have a Q&A session after the panelists are done. And at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A tab. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type that in, especially as they speak, and just put that in. And when we get to the Q&A session, we will try to get to everyone's questions. So first of all, I will hand the floor over to Obi. As I mentioned earlier, Obi is going to show us a short documentary video that he's put together. And he's going to talk a little bit about the impact of the pandemic, the closures on low-cost private schools specifically. Welcome, Obi.
Hi, everyone. My name is Obi Ulu. I am a communications consultant for the Center for the Study of the Economies of Africa. I have a video about 8 minutes long I prepared for this webinar, but I want to give a little context before you watch the video. Borrowing a phrase that Dr. Adediji just used, this pandemic for low-income Nigerians has predominantly been a financial pandemic. You know, the impacts on themselves have been economic. And before the pandemic, over 40% of Nigerians were already living below the poverty line. Again, one of the biggest drivers for exclusion in education was poverty and is poverty. And if the pandemic has deepened poverty in Nigeria, by extension, it has widened the learning gaps, you know, in different ways. So I'd like you to watch the video now, and then beyond the video, I will give you my thoughts and recommendations. So Emily, if you would. Emily, if you can hear me, there's no sound.
Oops, sorry about that.
Could you start it?
Toward that promise of...
Is it good? Can you hear the sound?
Yes, the
Sorry
sound.
about that. I'll start it over.
Thank you.
Toward that promise of learning for all, we run this race. But there are those who are stalled, who can scarcely keep the pace. For while the children ahead advance in their ones and twos, these ones hang back, for you see, they have no shoes. So this is for the ones we left behind, and for the ones who have departed the track. We must return for them, and we must help them find their way back. Now more than ever before, for the great villain stands in their way, to force them further behind and push them further astray. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, the proposition of universal basic education in Nigeria was already a largely problem-riddled one, with the country holding the highest number for out-of-school children globally. The pandemic has served to expose the gaping learning divides, which run along income lines. But not only this, it has also expanded these divides even further. With schools closed down for months, households that can have mitigated learning losses to meaningful extents by leveraging multimedia, e-learning, and other resources to access supplemental teaching. What is more, with higher household income levels, generally indicative of higher parent education levels, many within this demographic have been able to provide effective teaching themselves to their wards as well. However, low-income households conversely find the costs of supplemental teaching beyond their means. And parents here predominantly do not possess sufficient literacy skills either to impart any needed learning. The outcome is that while children from financially sturdy households have mostly kept up learning over the prolonged intermission, school-aged children from impoverished homes have been left behind. And this within the population where the vast majority of out-of-school children already come from. Furthermore, for families on the low end of the wealth divide, who live on daily earnings and for whom the pandemic has thinned income streams to measures inadequate even to subsist on, mounting existential necessities easily take precedence over the long-term promise of returns on educational investment. In other words, with rising costs of living and threatened livelihoods, it is becoming far more meaningful to some impoverished Nigerians to deploy their children into income-yielding endeavors rather than enroll them in the income-depleting one that is education. We must remember that for many of the country's poor, their predicaments and experiences condition them to focus almost solely on immediate gratification and not on long-term yields. The economically stifling impact of the pandemic on Nigeria's low-income households has weakened already feeble parental commitments to the prospect of education in many quarters. Learning-age children here are now at risk of being taken away from the classrooms and into the labor force to bolster the meager incomes of their families. An ongoing study by the Research on Improving Systems of Education, RISE project, and the Center for the Study of the Economies of Africa, CC, in Nigeria, is investigating this and other novel situations around education in the country that are incidental to the coronavirus pandemic. Using low-cost private schools in Abuja FCT, the study is designed to measure impacts of parental investment on learning, particularly in the context of the pandemic, and to investigate supplemental teaching interventions as wholesome means for replacing learning losses among socio-economically disadvantaged children. Through different methods of interaction with school owners, teachers, and parents at these schools, members of the RISE Country Research Team communicate with them about their concerns regarding the safe resumption of schools. While they generally express commitment to conforming with official COVID-19 related health and safety protocols, for these low-cost schools, their worries about resumption are not so much about the health dangers that the coronavirus poses, as they are about the economic and learning loss problems. How can they afford the cost-intensive safety requirements like disinfection and fumigation on their lean resources? How can they even afford to provide clean water and soap constantly for hand washing in places like theirs with no running water? How can they afford a steady supply of hand sanitizers? Can every parent afford to provide face masks for their child? With limited physical spaces, how can they achieve social distancing with the number of students that they have? How can they sufficiently cover school running costs, particularly regarding remuneration and arrears for teaching staff, some of whom abandoned the vocation over the closures for other endeavors like farming and trade? Most importantly, how can they restore all the learning that the returning children have lost and bring them to speed? How can they also deal with the threat of students who will not return? How might they sell the idea once more of education to the financially bereft parents of these ones? How can they restore to education within their wealth quintiles all that the pandemic has taken away from it? It is here at schools like this that you find most of the children on the wrong end of the learning divide, and the children who are at most risk of discontinuing with education. And for these children, the coronavirus has pushed them backwards even more. The worry for these schools is how to stop the pandemic from keeping these children back here.
All right, thank you very much, Emily. Apologies for the quality of the video, but I hope everyone heard, at the very least, the voiceover. So I think that pretty much says it all. My input to this webinar around low-cost schools, low-cost private schools, and I've done a lot of work over the past months, especially during this pandemic with schools like this. And I think they encapsulate that problem around low-income families and the problems of, around learning that are contingent to poverty. So when we talk about resumption of schools, I think it's a different problem for different demographics, because I'll give you an example with Abuja FCT, where I currently reside and where the work that the video referenced is domiciled. Now, for Abuja FCT, the schools were asked to forgo the third term because just before the pandemic, they were going to take exams, and this was the end of the second term, and they were about to enter the third, but they have been asked to forgo the third term and then start with the first term of, the next year. I hope that makes sense. So the implications for low-cost private schools are manifold, because their earnings are meager to begin with, so they have lost a lot of funding, all the fees they would have gotten from the third term. And not just that, a lot of learning that would have been acquired by students in the third term are foundational and requisite to, the next year. That's been lost, so the implications are, for instance, these schools owe teachers from the months prior. And some of these teachers have left teaching altogether and gone to other things just to be able to make a living. what teachers that there are now are worried about the abilities of the school owners to pay them. So that has diminished their commitment. And we all know, especially the educators here, how important teacher commitment is to that process of learning. And then you have students in the new year who are not really, they've lost a lot of learning. You know, over the pandemic, they were not able to mitigate learning losses. They didn't have any resources. They didn't have access to supplemental teaching and all of that. So you have students, you know, in a year they're not prepared to be in, and who have lost a lot of learning, being taught by teachers who are worried about remuneration. So this is just one facet of the problem. And I think what I'm trying to say is that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach that should be adopted in terms of reopening schools. Nigeria, like we all know, has the highest figure for out of school. Most of them belong to this low income demographic. So I think policy should focus on this group, you know, and policy should be fit, you know, to bring them along, because the learning gaps are much wider now, you know, because of the pandemic, you know. So I think if anything should be taken away from my input to this, it's that recommendation that policy more than ever, you know, should importantly focus on low income groups, you know, students in these areas and their education needs, because, you know, their needs are different from the needs of everybody else. So thank you very much. I will leave it here for now.
Thank you very much, Obi. That was an insightful video and good point to note, because I mean, kids in low-cost schools are the ones who tend to fall through the crack because they sort of fall in that middle place between the public schools and the private schools. And so thank you, that was important. I will hand the floor over now to Dr. Falake. And Dr. Falake, just to guide your conversation a little bit, I think we're interested in knowing some of the things that the government has done, or the approaches that they've used to gauge teaching and learning experiences during the lockdown, especially before we initiated the reopening of schools and curriculum continuation. And how exactly was this information, or has this information been used and shared amongst education stakeholders, so the parents, the teachers, and officials too, at both the federal level, but the state and the local levels?
Thank you, Thelma. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this discussion, which is very, very apt. A lot has been said, which I may not need to repeat, but we all know that at the outbreak of the pandemic, and in considering all that's happened and looking at the situation in Nigeria in particular, the federal government, in consultation with other stakeholders in the sector, made a stand to close down all schools for safety reasons, as we had total lockdown of other sectors as well. In fact, the whole country is good news to us. And then there was put in place a response strategy to handle the situation, which we have documented on our website to show what exactly we need to do, and to also check the situation as things improve. How do we come back to living the new normal? How it should be done in phases. Looking at the situation, how the health situation, how the indicators for well-being, general well-being, is shown, and then we take the proactive step. And by the time we go to the peak of this situation, but we realized that even though schooling was closed down, learning has to continue. And every effort was put in place to ensure that learning continued. We are all aware of the number of out-of-school children we have, but which is not correctly quoted.
Sorry, Dr. Falake, I think your Microphone is muted.
Okay, at what stage? What was the last? Is it just now?
It just 2 seconds ago, so you're okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was talking about that even before the pandemic, like we are all aware, we had quite a number of children that are out of school. But then a lot of interventions had been put in place to ensure that children are in school. I hear quite a number of us quoting 13.5 million children out of school. Yes, we had 13.5 as of 2015, but a lot of intervention had been done. And as at last count, I'm happy to tell you that we have had reduction by 3 million children, over 3 million. If you can check the personnel audit that we conducted in 2018, and even in our own, with MBS, our own digest of education, so you can get the right data. We have 10.193 children, 10.193 million children out of school now. So we have improved, because of the intervention with the support of partners at the state level, at the federal level, before the pandemic, the number has reduced. It's not as if we are saying, oh, it's good to have 10 million children out of school, but to let us know that we are not resting on our oars, and what we are doing is actually yielding results. So you can please check that and correct the figures we are quoting. And then, yes, the next was conducted in 2015, Education Data Survey, but then there's another one conducted in 2019. So we need to update our figures, and it has shown tremendous improvements. So you can check that of 2019 so that we will not be quoting obsolete figures in doing our analysis, because a lot of intervention will depend on what we quote from our data sources. We need to update them. Now, back to the issue of the pandemic. So we, as the government, at the federal and the state level, we know that learning has to continue. And the federal government, Federal Ministry of Education encouraged the states to ensure that whatever needs to be done is done to ensure that learning goes on. So at the state level, which majorly the schools belong to them, a lot of innovation in radio, television, even the private schools, they had their digitalization using the internet, and the rest of them was done. This is not to say that we are unaware of quite a number that will not be able to have access because of the cost of accessing this, but a lot of effort went into doing this. And in doing this, even for the learning, the digitalized learning, we had in it embedded the measure of measuring the learning that goes on. I'm happy that we have Mr. Olushola Bankole here, the private schools owner, that most of them were able to use the internet, to use the social media, and the rest of them to use internet-based learning and audiovisuals to continue training, teaching, and learning of in the schools, in the children's homes. They were able to assess their performance as well as teach them during the pandemic. And of course, for those, even at the state level, some of the state governments, in fact, majority of them, they were using the traditional modes, the television and radio, to air educational programs. And most of them, even if it's 1 hour, and then they had timetable, we have situation, and then with support of development partners like RANA, they had already developed programs even before then. We were able to continue this, and other states also learned from the situation. Now, as things got better, we cannot stay at home forever. And remember, we had a response plan to phase return to school. And then, so we put in place guidelines for reopening of schools. And these guidelines was based on certain principles. We didn't just come up as a federal to impose things on the state. The guidelines for reopening was based on the principle of consultation, We had extensive consultation with the states and the local governments, and even with the organized private sector, the proprietors of schools, if the SBM says, the traditional rulers, to see what can be done. Even when we have the guideline, we see consulted widely. And then we also looked at consideration for scientific evidence and transparency in providing advices so that we could build trust and confidence in the parents, even among the public. So even when we look at things that can be done, we look at how can we build trust and confidence, because even if you reopen schools and the parents do not trust us, they will not send their children to school. And then we also use the principle of taking responsibility, roles and responsibilities for different levels, at the federal level, at the state level, local government, school level, even the parents, even the children, we all have responsibility to play in keeping safe and learning. So we looked at this principle. What are the roles? What are the responsibilities? How do you take care of what you need to do to ensure safety and then to ensure that learning continues and credible results are obtained? And then we looked at the principle of enabling the federal, the state, and local governments to be ready to fund and to provide for the resources that is needed for the schools during and even especially at this post-pandemic period. Because it's not just about reopening schools, we also, our objective is also to make the system resilient, such that when we have other emergency situations such as this, we are not praying to have such, but things happen, that the system will be able to cope with shocks and be able to absorb this. So those are the major principles that we use: consulting widely, ensuring that we have, we take responsibility, ensuring that we make consideration, and for any evidence, any advice we are giving, we took a proper consideration to build trust and confidence in all stakeholders. And doing this, we were able to establish some guidelines for the states to reopen and to reopen safely, to ensure that learning continued, and that even the educators, the administrators, and the learners, they undertake teaching and learning in a safe and well-protected environment. So a lot of things were put in place to ensure safety operations, to ensure protection and well-being, learning, inclusiveness, policy. In the area of for safety operations, we set up minimal standards, national minimum standards for all states and all schools to employ, to ensure that before you can reopen schools in your state, these are the things that are to be in place. Not just the physical things of the wash, even the health requirements, and we ensure that this is properly disseminated. To that extent, at the end of middle of September, we had a national stakeholders meeting in all these geopolitical zones involving all the state commissioners of education. We invited the commissioners of health in the states, the local government education offices, the private proprietors, the school-based management committees, and even the NUT. We had zonal meetings for in all the 6 geopolitical zones to ensure that these principles and the guidelines are well understood by all as the schools reopen. Like I said, we had a phased reopening. We had the terminal classes because of the examinations they had to write, which is not limited to Nigeria. Other countries like WAEC, they had to sit together. So we ensure that even at that, before that is done, that the children will go back and write the examination in safe environments. Monitoring was done nationally. We have FECA's offices all over the country. They ensure that the states were ready. And then even at the national level, we also went out at the Directorate CADA to ensure that all the states were really ready, and our unity colleges as well. Don't forget, we have 104 unity colleges spread across the nation. So we ensure that we have safety operations and protection and well-being of all learners. That is another thing that we ensured. And we had the guidelines for all this. Like I said earlier, it is the principle of consultation. Even when we propose, we ensure that everyone, every stakeholder at all levels, even development partners are part of this, ensure that they look at what they need to do. And we said principle of responsibility and roles. And then for learning, we ensure that we gave the guideline that states must then provide safe learning environment. Digitalization of learning is also encouraged to continue what the gains we had. Even though we had COVID-19, it's not a good experience, but it's like a blessing in disguise, because even though we've been talking about digitalization of learning, technology age, this was brought more to the fore because of this COVID-19 pandemic that we had. So we realized that we have no choice but to encourage this form of learning. We may now have blended mode. We still continue to have the virtual learning and the face-to-face interaction. So this is encouraged. And then inclusiveness to ensure that no learner is left behind, especially those from poor backgrounds, poor socioeconomic background, the disabled, girls in some parts, boys in some parts, that nobody is left behind, that all learners are included and their interests are well taken care of. And then there are policies on ground, which we formulated at the national level with all the stakeholders and ensure that the states the uptake at the state level for proper implementation. And then also we are looking at supporting to mobilize funds, both within and from partners, in ensuring that all these things we put that is required, because there are a huge amount of resources is required to ensure that all the protocols and the rest of it, ensuring teachers are properly trained, not only the pedagogy, but also providing additional support for learners that may be traumatized, providing psychosocial support, because a lot might be traumatized due to the experience they've had during this pandemic. A lot might have been harassed or might be going through tough times because of the situation. So teachers need to be, even the teachers themselves need support. And we are encouraging states and other partners to also provide this. Like we know, even teachers in the private sector, a lot of them were not paid, not because the owners don't want to pay, but because the means of resources was cut short. So they also need support. So we're encouraging states and other partners to also provide this for teachers and to also teach teachers to also provide for learners. And then for monitoring and coordinating, because even when we put all this in place and we don't do proper monitoring, then we may not be sure of getting the desired result. So we have set up for monitoring templates and provided this to the states to constantly monitor the progress of work and the requirements as laid down, as agreed by everyone. And then of course, we also will ensure that we also support with proper coordination, because a lot of activities are ongoing, both locally. We have a lot of people coming up with, okay, we can provide this form of learning, this app is there, and that provision is there, but we need to really ensure that this is properly coordinated so that we may not get misinformation and then get derailed in the process of wanting to embrace technology. And of course, for the partners that are coming in so that we can really spread, we'll not be reinventing the wheel, we'll know the areas that really need support, because a lot of support is really coming in. And then like one of the speakers earlier said, even within the country, the government has made a lot of provision through CBN. Private school owners are also qualified to apply for this. So we have sensitized them and we keep doing this one. So these are some of the things we are doing to ensure that quality learning goes on, to ensure that no child is left behind, to ensure that we don't go back on the gains we have had before COVID, and to ensure that we have a resilient system, not just mitigating the effect of COVID-19, but also building a resilient education system that can withstand a test of any shock. Let me stop here so that we can continue with the discussion from other people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Falake. That was great. I will now hand over the floor to Mrs. Olushola, who will be speaking on the impact of the lockdowns on private school students. She'll talk a little bit as well about how private schools are mitigating some of the learning losses that students have had. But I would also like you to speak a little bit on how you think that teachers and other education personnel can be supported to cope with smooth curriculum transition as schools are reopening.
All right, thank you so much. And I've actually, enjoyed thoroughly all the earlier presentations, particularly when Dr. Additional. Yeah, I didn't even wrong. Yeah, he actually spoke my mind to a large extent. Yeah, so quickly, of course, we know the pandemic came, it crept in on everybody unawares. We didn't plan for it, most especially in Nigeria, where we seem to be used to not, using fire brigade method to mitigate things. And, that's how it crept in on us. We weren't prepared, we weren't ready. But like Dr. Sin in disguise, the COVID pandemic. And the truth is, I remember I've attended a few webinars in the recent past where we were talking about post-COVID preparations for schools, how to mitigate other pandemic or issues and all that. And here we are, another pandemic is here, another problem is here. I stay, my school is in Apo, I'm actually in school right now. And in fact, I've been receiving a lot of calls to leave the school because, there are a lot of crises and chaos around where I am. In fact, we asked students not to come to school today. And, just a few teachers came to school just to have online classes. But what I've decided to do today is to just load their credit on their MyFis. They came to pick their MyFis to take home in case they can't come to school tomorrow for the online classes. So we need to, maybe interviews that I've granted. I've also talked about the need to be serious with education in Nigeria. I remember I was also in one webinar with the Honorable Minister of State for Education, and I told him, I said, sir, we need to see more commitment to education. It is true, we all know it, and we need to show it that we value education in Nigeria, education sector generally, and we need to do something quickly. All right, sorry. No matter how much we want to develop other sectors, if we don't have quality education, Obi also, when he was presenting his video, started with quality education. It's not just giving education, gathering children somewhere, and then somebody's an adult who's just shouting at them, who's just, telling down their throats. So we need to actually, this pandemic actually, affected the education sector so badly. And I want to say maybe that's one of the most we know it affected every sector generally across the world, not just in Nigeria, but the education sector across the world. But what's it in Nigeria? And most importantly, the private sector. A lot of our teachers weren't able to get any income since April. We just resumed and it has started again. I've received 2 messages while this webinar is on, where parents were asking that they want to defer their children's resumption to January. wasn't school yesterday. We have, partly, a few children were in school yesterday. Today, I just told every parent to keep their children at home. And, that's what we're seeing, this crisis of the hoodlums taking over the protests all over the place. I learned those states has declared a lockdown. Lagos State has declared a lockdown. So we need to really be serious at getting ourselves ready to keep our children learning, even when I've seen that coming, of course, many years back, and we have planned around it to make sure that even when the children are at home, something can go on. And I want to believe, a lot of people say, oh, there is no electricity, there is no this. I am a believer in where there is a will, there is always a way. If we are serious about it, I'm sure somehow we will find a way around it. Instead of, in my school, for instance, I've not increased the cost of books for like 7 years. And people ask me, so how do you do it? Do you steal the money? I just simply tell parents, get your children a laptop, and then we're going to put ebooks on their laptop. The ebooks are always there. They can always read. And of course, they copy notes, and but not, I don't like too much notes. Just key points that the children can, go over to prepare themselves for, assessment and all of that. So for the private schools, we envisaged some of these issues when schools are going to reopen. We had a 3-week weekend intensive training for all members. Of course, in some of the webinars, we had like 400 members, who came in. We even started having members from other states joining us, where we did an intensive training on what to do, how to prepare, and in fact, to support the members, because it was really serious. We provided a credit facilities for members through our cooperative society. Some were able to get the hand washing stations, the infrared thermometers, and all the basic things that are required for safe reopening. Another thing we did in FCT, NAPS, and no, national generally, but we also stepped it down in FCT a bit, is mental, we consider the mental health of proprietors, of teachers, and we asked every school to step all that down when school reopened. I hope, I am hoping that, many schools have started considering that since we reopened last week. Then a core challenge which cuts across is assessment. How do we even know what this is? For instance, in this period, when schools reopen, different states decided to reopen as they deem fit. In Lagos State, I think they reopened, for first term. There are states that reopened straight into, reopened into third term to cover what, learning loss may have been, what they are supposed to learn in third term last session, 2019, 2020. But some of us reopened into a new session. We stopped when we were going to write exam. The schools were closed in second term. So there was third term gap there. There were not many schools that could go online. Of course, we have more local schools than the regular private schools in the private sector. And so we had to organize a training online too in FCT, where we were looking at identifying learning gaps, how to do that in quick mode, how to easily identify the learning gaps in the children. And we're able to look at what are the topics you are supposed to cover in second. We need to even go back to first term, because the children, many of them have been at home for over 6 months doing nothing. Even those schools that were offering online classes, there were a lot of parents that could not join. So we felt, everybody, please, even if it is within a short period, we can look at all the topics we are supposed to cover. As simple as going through those topics you're supposed to have learned, and then giving them as assignments, or guiding them through some whatever, or maybe having weekend classes, if that is permitted in the locations where we are, or in some cases giving them, of course, blended learning as well. The benefits of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, is it's helping us to get serious, to get to prepare all that we need, all the tools we need to get our children learning anywhere they are, whether they are at home, whether they come to school, and wherever they are. So we looked at that. And then we also had a training where we did talked extensively on the importance of life skills. Life skills are, things, English language, and all of those that we pay a lot of attention to. We have decided that, okay, let's consider life skills, soft skills, negotiation skills, even the 4 C's, collaboration, creativity, and all of those. How do we get that? So that the quality of learning of these children is going to be really useful, impactful, and supportive of what we really want to achieve as a nation, the goals of the nation to help to develop the nation. So those are some of the things that we have looked at. And I'll just quickly now talk about what some of us have done concerning baseline assessment. We decided to look at, okay, the core subject of maths and English, and some we recommended, okay, let's look at science as well. What are the core skills in mathematics for grade 1 child? What are the core skills that a child in grade 8 is supposed to have? That's just to, across the classes. And then we try to sort of create keys or grades, not in numbers now, but okay, if a child is at this level, it's not just asking all these regular 2 times 1, what is it? No, we're looking at skills, okay, mathematical skills of being able to think through numbers. That when you see these kind of numbers, how do you identify how to solve it? Maybe it is multiplication, addition, skill that you're going to need to use to solve it. So all of these, I'm sure when schools consider that, beyond just rushing into the new session, okay, the topic says we should do this. Okay, children, they said we should teach you this. Go ahead, let us teach you. And all of beyond that, we need to also, and I'm also suggesting that even those in the Ministry of Education should please begin to help us to, so that the widening gap between private schools and public schools, I feel odd. I am a product of public school all my life. I went to public, and I believe that when we have quality public schools, we will also have more qualitative private schools. So I am pleading that we begin to look at the education we are giving the children beyond, okay, they say you should learn measurement, and so you do hand span, and then you use tape and all that, to looking at how we bring this education to suit particularly even our needs in Nigeria, on whatever the subject is, whether it's math or English or science or art or whatever, and all of that. And then I'll round up finally by saying that we need to continue to prepare for learning, continuous learning for our children as they go on the road, as they're in their places, in their homes. And I know that is possible. We don't have all the time, and I don't want to take so much of our time, but I think I've been able to emphasize key things. One, that, okay, the pandemic actually affected both teachers, proprietors, parents, children, and everybody. And that's why we looked at the need for, supporting the mental health of everyone in the system. Some of the children, when they even came into school, they want to hug. They want to hug someone because, they've been home, missing their friends and all of that. It was a tall order. It was a tough one, particularly that last week, to get them to say no again. Some of them secretly hugged anyway, but in a way, somehow it's a way of therapy for some of them to get them to calm down and all of that. So we need to actually look at that. And from what Thelma asked concerning teachers generally, how to support teachers to continue to be able to deliver their work, it's important also that we look at the teaching profession generally. What's the value we place on teachers in Nigeria? Do we see them as the nation builders, the nurturers of our tomorrow, of our leaders? Or do we see teachers as, okay, never do wells, who couldn't make some big cutoff points or high cutoff points, and then they found themselves in the classroom and they are teaching? We need to also reorganize, revamp, reorder our teacher education in Nigeria generally. I'll stop here so that I'll be able to allow others to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Olusola. That was great. That was insightful information. I will just transition us quickly to the Q&A section of this. And I think what you talked about, so 2 seconds or about 2 minutes ago, about kids trying to keep kids from hugging each other. One of the questions that a panelist, that a participant had asked was, how do you actually enforce like the social distancing in school and all the other things that they need to maintain safety while the students are in school? Sorry, Mr. Lucia, that question was.
Oh, okay. Is that question for me?
Yes, that question was
right
for you. Yes.
Yeah, you know, personally, as human beings, we thrive on relationships, quality relationships. I knew that we're going to have a tough time getting these children to hold themselves. Those that were in the exam classes, the senior I3, that's SS3 and GS3, when they came in, they were able, I mean, they weren't so many. We were able to actually, but along the line, some of them also started, well, like, oh, excuse me, okay, I'm not hugging too much, I'm just touching, you know, and then, you know, this elbow greeting, you know, was in vogue. But for the younger ones, it's a gradual process. They know, I graciously, some of the parents have also helped out by preparing them for, okay. And then of course the sitting arrangements actually gives it social distancing, but while they are going home, some of them will rush to touch their friend. Hey, how are you? Or something like that. But I know it's a gradual process. We'll get over it little by little. What I think is important is for them to know the reason why they are not hugging, so that it can also help them to recalibrate their mind that it's not because I hate that person or that person has a plague or a disease, or because that's the interpretation some of the very young ones are thinking it's provided. I mean, it's given them. But if, gradually, I'm sure they will get to adjust little by little.
Perfect, thank you. The next question that I have is directed to you, Dr. Falake, and it says, what logistical arrangements were put in place for the preparation of a conducive environment in order to facilitate learning in a timely manner, given everything that was happening, especially in public schools? Dr. Falake, are you still on?
In a timely manner, given the current climate. Yes, like we said, is my internet okay now?
Yes, we can hear you.
So like we said, a lot of roles and responsibilities were given out, but the guidelines were provided to provide an environment that is safe. So all the health protocols are to be observed, like Mrs. Bankole just said, to ensure that the classrooms are well spaced out, even for the states, to ensure that the classrooms are well spaced out. And where we have large numbers, to even be innovative about it. Some of the classes are held, they are staggered classrooms. The students don't all have to be in school at the same time. we have extended hours so that we can space out the children. And then when they go to break, they don't have to to go on break at the same time, so that there won't be clusters or there won't be crowded auditoriums or dining halls for those that are in boarding school. So the states came together, like we said. It's not as if maybe we just imposed anything. They looked at what is working and what can work. And we reviewed it together, and then they adapted what can work in the state. So even where they are not practicing what is good enough, in quotes, when they learn from others, they are now able to say, okay, we'll go back to our states and adopt what we are doing to ensure we have better results and to ensure we have safe learning environments. Some states even go as far as saying we can extend our classes to Saturdays. Some states, some classes will come maybe shift, some they staggered, and then knowing fully well that the examination classes have now gone back, are no longer in school. We now have just the other classes in place. Then they are able to have more spaces. And of course, a lot is required. Like even some schools, we cannot shy away from it, and some schools don't even have running water in the school, but it is now the responsibility of the SBMCs, because even if you don't have water in the school, there are people in the community and they get water. So whatever source they are using to get the water, they should also come together as the community. The school is for their children and get whatever way they have to organize themselves, and they agree to do it. We involve the traditional rulers to ensure that they have water in school. And for learning, a lot has been said, and a lot of innovation is being taken up as well to ensure that we not only use the face-to-face, we have come into the era that we cannot but digitalize learning, teaching and learning. And this has come to stay. And states they are imbibing this. Even the low-cost schools, they are also imbibing this. There are a lot of apps that you can just download. You don't have to have internet connectivity. Once it's downloaded, you can use it to teach. And then even for radio and TV programs, and you have a lot of innovation in place. Some of them are very cheap. Some of them have been supported, and states are taking advantage of this. So a lot is going on, and what we need is really the determination to ensure that we achieve this, and this is going on. I tell you, even for the issue of reopening of schools, some that even reopened earlier that have started even on the next session, when we met and they saw that, oh, the students they would have lost a lot for not learning in total. Like Plateau State, the commissioner said they will go back to their state and inform them why they have to go back to third term, so that they don't have to impose and start the next session without adequately covering the third term syllabus. Same thing for Ogun State and Lagos State. So they are looking at this, and for those that are committed that, okay, we want to go on, they are committed that they will ensure that the syllabuses are covered. And of course, the curriculum, we have to adapt what we are teaching. We cannot remain stagnant and say, okay, this is the old way of doing things. And we are looking at all this and taking the right step in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you. You just mentioned the curriculum and essentially starting in third term versus starting in the new year. One of the questions here is, so a lot of schools have resumed, and they've resumed a new year. So if a student was in JS1 before, they're now in JS2. And I guess the question is asking, why is that the situation? And is there sort of like any mandate from the government to state anywhere saying, okay, you guys need to ensure that you complete the curriculum of this term, or schools just have the sorts of free will to do what they want to do in this situation?
The states have the responsibility to set the calendar for their schools. It's a prerogative of the state and the FCT Education Secretariat. But then they are guided by the external examination. No matter the calendar you set for your state, you still have to write the public examination when it's time to write. You don't have absolute control over that. So, but then we can always guide them, what we are doing. Like I mentioned, one of the states that already said they are committed to starting the new term straight off But when we discussed, specifically at the Northeastern Zonal meeting, where all the states and even the private sector, they were part of it, and the SBMCs and the NUT and the rest of them. When we discussed and they saw the benefit of having to hold on to ensure that the children are well grounded in the syllabus before moving on to the next session to finish up the work of the last session. And then we can now start on a new note in January and then maybe reduce the holiday period between the terms. And then we can move on from there. Because even if you set your calendar to start the new session immediately, you still have to wait till July next year before you write your WAEC and the other public examinations. You can only just relax and have the other one, but then you have missed out. Your children might not have, students might not have studied or covered all that they need to learn for this session that we are in. So it is wisdom for them, but the states have the prerogative to set the calendar. So even the private schools, they get their cue from the states or from the FCT Education Secretariat. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Deji, the next question is for you, and it essentially asks, what are some practical ways to implement teaching at the right level?
Okay, hello. So thanks for that question. As I mentioned, there is actually no straightforward way to do it. But I mean, one of the idea that we can implement, especially along this COVID-19, is to dedicate some school hours in terms of, for instance, I mean, we have classes, primary 1, primary 2, primary 3, I mean, the normal grade structure.
Sorry, Deji, I think we lost you.
Some school hours, we don't need to, maybe from 8 to, we can just dedicate it in terms of risk grade level, but by skill level of the. Can you hear me now? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is, so that's one way we can do it, by restructuring classrooms in a way that we just quickly do a simple assessment on these kids. We know this different skill level, then we classify them to their skill level, such that you should be by your knowledge level, you should be at this grade. We can mix this with typical grade level, such that parent doesn't have a lot of concerns about their kids. So that's one way to do it. Another way, we can do it is through supplemental lessons and blended
Deji might be having a bit of internet connectivity
learning too, which means that school hour, we can use the post-provide and ensure that for their level, so that we can upgrade them to the level they are, while they might still in the morning participate in the normal school hour. So there is a lot of things we could do, but I like that too in the context of COVID-19, given the lesson loss that we've experienced.
Thank you very much, Deji. Just looking at the time now, we've run over by about 4 minutes. So that was the very last question. Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for the conversations. Very insightful. Just to point everyone again to the policy brief, I will add the link again because now there's been so many questions and it's just moved up in the chat. I'll add the link again, but the policy brief essentially highlights a lot of the conversations that have been had today. So feel free to read it, send comments if you have any comments whatsoever, and we'll be happy to get back to you. Thank you, ID Insights and CC team, for putting this together. And yeah, everybody have a wonderful afternoon.